welcome to the first episode of the For The Reef podcast, where we dive into the reef keeping hobby, coral reef conservation, and everything in between. My name is Mitch Dender.
And I'm Ian Bell.
And together, we're reef keepers. So we decided to make this podcast just to kind of, talk about our love for the reef keeping hobby, talk about our love for reef conservation, and really just to kind of get excited about this kind of stuff. And so my name is Mitch, and I am a fisheries biologist right now. Both Ian and I live in Ontario, Canada, which is north. So I'm a fisheries biologist right now, working in consulting for mostly for highway construction, bridges, and that sort of thing. So I get to work with fish all the time, creating habitat, developing offsetting plans when fish habitat is lost. And from the very, very young age, I've been really obsessed with aquariums and, as I like to sometimes say, everything under the water. As fish keepers, I'm sure we've all felt, people call us like we love fish, but really that just capsules one tiny bit of what we love. Hey, Ian?
Yeah, I've heard the word fish geek on more than one occasion in my household.
Yeah, it's like, I like more than just fish, but yeah. So that's kind of what I've done. I mean, I've went through school now. I did my master's in fisheries biology. I've been working as a professional biologist now for about 8 years. I've kept fish tanks, I guess, since I was around 12 years old. My first tank was a 30-gallon freshwater tank that I overstocked with angelfish, overfed the angelfish, and those angelfish unfortunately didn't last very long. But that's kind of where my reef keeping hobby has taken off, and I'll be happy to describe everything else that's going on throughout these episodes. But I'll let Ian introduce himself too.
Yeah, my name is Ian Bell. My background is in emergency services. Prior to doing what I do now, I've been with fire departments for various places for almost 20 years. I'm also a paramedic and an emergency rescue tech as well. I was working in Fort McMurray there for the last several years, but I got sick of being away and I needed to be home with my kids. And I got into the aquarium hobby about 7 years ago. Started with a 29-gallon BioCube, and now I own a fish store. I own Sustainable Marine Canada. That's a fairly large jump from a BioCube. But I love it. I can meet lots of great people. I've gotten involved in a lot of great things, and it was a really nice change. I still have my fingers in the fire department, but this is my main activity now.
Yeah, those BioCubes, I definitely had one of those back in the day. I remember I had one Maxima Clam, but those were beautiful tanks, and now we're all the way into like the Red Sea Reefer series and all these great all-in-one systems. So yeah.
I never imagined when I bought my BioCube that I'd now have many, many, many systems.
yeah, that's an understatement.
Yeah.
And I guess the where we really connected, I guess, is through coral reef conservation, actually, right? Mm-hmm. So another thing that I've done kind of as a side project for the last few years is a clothing conservation company called For The Reef. And what we do is we sell clothing, microplastic free clothing, and I'll kind of dig into what microplastic even means some other time. But I started this clothing company with my wife to try to raise money for coral conservation. After long obsession with this hobby and getting a lot of, the aquarium hobby has brought a lot of passion and happiness to my life, and seeing what's been going on with the coral reefs over the last, few decades has really affected me. And I guess I got into a point of my life where I had the means to do something about it. So that's why I started For The Reef, which, as I said, is a clothing company, and we've donated some money. And while we were getting started, I noticed that there was this other guy in London, Ontario, where we live, who was also involved in coral conservation, calling his store Sustainable Marine Canada. And I think, Ian, I don't know if you remember, but I think you might have reached out to me and we were both going to the Niagara Coral Show or something like that.
I think you actually reached out to me. I got an email one day from this Mitch Dender guy. I'm like, what's this guy want?
Yeah.
And you told me about your thing. He's like, hey, I want to come by and tell you about it. And it just kind of skyrocketed from there. I started my company with, the love for the hobby, of course, but also with the mindset that here's a platform and a group of people that are really interested, engaged, and a good conduit, in my opinion, to spread the word on what needs to be done, why it's important, what is being done, and whatnot. And I sort of make that an underlying message that my company puts out on a regular basis. I think it's important. We're, not only do we take from the reef, but now we're doing something back, but we also know more about it than the average person on the street, and we can engage others and try and sort of spread this need to do something about the reefs.
Yeah, that's something that has always really resonated with me, because I guess there's always a little bit of guilt, when you're keeping these fish that come from across the world, or these corals that come across from oceans away, and you're always thinking, especially as you're growing up. And I remember thinking, is this really ethical? Should I really be keeping these animals in captivity? But what really comes out of it is that throughout this hobby, by being involved in this hobby, it eventually led me into what I'm passionate about. It led into my career, and it's opened my eyes to something that's important to me, and eventually has led into me actually helping. So in my opinion, and actually I think that the research so far actually backs it up, that the impacts to coral reefs, the main culprit is climate change, and we all kind of know that, most of us, and it's the coral reef in the reef keeping hobby does have an impact, but I think it's something that's manageable just the same way that any other fisheries is. So overall, I think that the aquarium hobby is a really beneficial outlet for young people and older people alike to understand underwater ecosystems and get involved in it, and not only enrich their lives, but potentially enrich the ecosystems that they love.
Yeah, I think you can get into quite a discussion on the back and forth ideological sort of ideas on the aquarium hobby, but that's a whole nother episode. And if we're going to do that, we need to get Rich Ross involved, because he's the master.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's for sure. That is for sure. Even as it was coming out of my mouth, I'm like, oh yeah, this is a whole nother episode.
Yeah, that's a whole topic on its own. But I think that overall it's a benefit.
Totally. Yeah. So one other thing is I guess we have to talk about, especially you, running a store and keeping this hobby alive. How has COVID been affecting the reef keeping hobby from a store owner's perspective?
From a store owner's point of view, I didn't know what to expect when this started. I don't think any of us did. We surely expected an interruption in livestock and supply chain, and there was some of that to some degree. Livestock was really quite difficult to get for a little while, and certain products, if they were made in Asia, were quite difficult to get, and some in the Europe as well, because of supply chain shutdown and slowdown in shipping and stuff. But as far as the store itself, we were deemed an essential service because we're feeding pets, and we got busier. And I think that was the case for most stores. Everybody was home, so now they're working on the hobby. And from what I hear, across the continent, really, everybody got busy trying to keep up with the demand of everybody improving their tanks. I think if you ask a lot of people, their tank since March probably took a bunch of steps forward, where in most summers they would take a bunch of steps backwards because everybody's outside.
Oh, yeah.
Livestock's a different story, and it still somewhat is. For quite a while there was very difficult to get because airspace was limited or non-existent. And what you could get, the price of airspace was through the roof. I talked to the local wholesalers, and out of Australia, for example, the per kilo rate on shipping was astronomical. And you see that reflected in the prices, because it's not just the fish that you're paying for. A lot of the cost comes in the water that it's shipped in. So, excuse me, that's something to take into account when you're thinking about pricing. But getting it on the plane, getting it out of there, some of the, a lot of what I know is sort of third party, so I can't say all the for sure facts, but I understand that there's the situation over in the countries where a lot of these fish come from are maybe not as good as they are in Canada, COVID wise. So there are certain cities that have massive restrictions on people moving about, coming in and out of the city and whatnot. So that impedes things. And always, of course, anytime something's impeded, there's a cost attached to that, right? And just supply in general is really down. And I'm not finding that the pricing and things have been affected by supply so much as just the mere issues that are compounded in obtaining the product is what it seems like. It all has to do with flight space, if there's flight space, what you can get to begin with. And then the word on the street is that where things from certain countries might have been a little less expensive at one point, those industries in those countries are now having to try and recoup some of their losses from during COVID. So the price in general of the fish to begin with has gone up. So just as flight prices might be starting to slowly creep down, there's other costs being involved. So I don't think you're going to see a massive change in like a decrease back to the way it was in pricing anytime in the near future until things get back to normal. It's unfortunate. Things can be quite pricey. I get shocked myself sometimes, but they are what they are at the moment, and that's one of the downsides of COVID.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, that's something like I've definitely been continuing buying things during COVID, and I've noted, and I mean, I've been following the prices of things for long enough to know that they've gone up considerably. But at the end of the day, there is costs associated with this, and you can get deals in a lot of things. But I guess when it comes to we all need to think about that these are our animals, and
Yep.
you wouldn't skimp out on things when they got a little more expensive for your dog that you've had for 10 years. So I guess from my perspective personally, just as a consumer, the price increase is noticeable, but it's not something that's like, I don't think outrageous. You can still get the fish you want. You just got to pay a little bit extra.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bummer too about Indonesia and some of the other areas where coral imports were coming from, that they've slowed down, and for lots of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But in general, I mean, well, that actually leads us into our next kind of point too about the trade shows, because that's something that I always rely on is when you go to these trade shows, you might not be able to import from Indonesia right now, but people still have Indonesian corals in their tanks, and they might be willing to sell to you at these trade shows. That didn't actually happen this year.
Yeah, the whole thing's confusing for a lot of people. Those of us in the background have a little more insight into what's going on, but the people on the street don't really know the ins and outs of how things get here, what the costs are. And you have people, it's a rough time, so people are offering incentives and sometimes loss leaders and things to encourage people to come to their store and support their business. And that can confuse people. They're like, well, this fish is this price there, whatever, why aren't you charging that? And it's a personal individual thing. There's a lot more to it than just a face value. Like that could be an incentive just to get people to come. They're selling it to you cheap to get you to come and buy other stuff and make money. It's that, everybody's doing what they've got to do right now. The coral shows, that's a big thing. I mean, I'm now running the local coral show here in London. I had to put mine off, but for example, our big show in Ontario would be the Niagara Coral Show. That's a large ordeal for him. He's had to put that off several times. He has a substantial amount of money invested in it himself, and he's trying to do the best that he can to plan that. But there's so many factors at work there. Like we don't know if the border is going to be open, which there's a large amount of the vendors that are coming from the US. Well, if they can't come, that significantly impacts the show.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, all the obvious other factors that go along with that. It's a very strange time. I hear that there are a couple of US shows that are attempting to go ahead at the end of the year. But the way things are going in the US, I'll be shocked if they do.
Yeah, I mean, it does in overall, it seems like the restrictions and the rules and stuff like that in Canada are a little more strict than they are in the States right now.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was devastating to see, how much work Brian and, even I had a presentation ready,
Yeah.
before the Reef, I ordered in, lots of sweaters, and I had, lots of custom stuff for the show. And, those types of things, especially in the aquarium industry, where most of us are working in this industry in some capacity just out of passion for it. And,
Yeah.
and with that comes with, tight margins and that kind
Yeah.
of thing. And
None of us are, well, most of us aren't driving around in Maseratis or anything doing this. We do it because we love it. We're not doing it to get rich.
Yeah.
Sustainable Marine Canada, my company, was the speaker sponsor for the show. I had speakers lined up that I had paid for. Aaron from Coral Reef Eco Divers in Cayman Islands was set to come up and be one of the speakers, and we had to put a quick halt on everything. There were some big plans that were in the works that ground to a halt, and there's a lot of uncertainty. So I encourage everybody, when this does come around again, I mean, of course, as long as it's safe to do so, please support the show, because there's a lot of effort and money and time that's been put into it, and it really needs your support.
Yeah. Yep, for sure. And Ian, well, I guess Aaron, sorry, Aaron, Ian and Aaron, but Aaron from Cayman Eco Divers, who you've now, grown to be pretty close friends with, who runs a coral conservation group, a nonprofit out in the Cayman Islands. Do you want to describe them a little bit?
Yeah. So Mitch was previously, through his fundraising company there, was engaged with another organization that does reef restoration work, and one to the other, we've got to know each other, and I've told him more about what Aaron does at Cayman Eco Divers Reef Restoration Foundation. I have to get that name exactly right or I'll be in trouble. But it's a grassroots thing. It's all run by volunteers. It's in the Cayman Islands. Aaron Hunt is the fellow's name that runs it, and his wife Brittany, and they operate this thing without government financing. It's all done on donations and with the support of the other dive shops on the island, and it's really quite impressive what they're accomplishing there. They're hoping to take the work that they do and share it with other islands in the area in similar geographical situations that Cayman is. We'll have Aaron on, and he'll explain this a lot better than I do, but Cayman is an interesting island in the way that it's positioned, and it's got deep water on all sides that wells up and keeps things fresh, and just their whole approach is just a little bit different than what some of the other places are doing. And being volunteer driven, anybody can go there and participate. They're always looking for assistance, and that's kind of what Mitch and I like about it. I met Aaron through some friends of mine that live on the island. I go there quite often. It's become like a second home to me, and they introduced me to Aaron, and I'm beyond impressed with the man. He's a former U.S. military, and he has organized this with his wife from ground zero. And he has the support of the government, but they don't have any funding from the government. It all comes from businesses on the island, local participation, and wherever else he can raise funds from. So I've taken an active role trying to raise funds from this end, and I've gotten Niagara Coral Show on board to be a large donor. I have other companies that I've been talking with, such as Reef Nutrition and a few others, that are willing to get involved in some way. We're going to just try and figure out how that's going to happen. And Mitch with For The Reef has joined us as well. So we're working towards finding out the best way we can support Aaron, whether is that cash, is that finding him student researchers or professors that can come down and find out some of the information that he needs, or help him remotely, or whatever that may be. There's a lot to it, but I look forward to getting Aaron on here, and he'll be a regular feature of our show, sort of updating everybody on what's going on down there.
Yeah. That's one of the coolest things about kind of extending from our coral reef hobby, where we're looking into our tanks and seeing these corals grow, and then all the way out to what they're doing front lines coral reef science is incredible.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I mean, with For The Reef in the first few years, we worked closely with Seacor International, as you know, and we did coral restoration work with them. We donated over $20,000, and we're really proud of that. And that coral reef conservation is very different. Well, I can't say very different, but it is different than what Aaron is doing with Cayman Eco Divers. So just to give everybody an idea of what I mean by that is, as we all know, corals are an animal and they reproduce, and there's different ways of going about that, and ways of creating new genetic material, i.e. when corals are going through a lot of stress out in the environment, especially from things like climate change or things like runoff from the surrounding lands, or being taken from the ocean and put into our tanks. All those types of things are stressors, and on a genetic level, the animal needs to be flexible. So in order to have flexibility, you need diversity in your population, because if everybody's the same and a stressor comes in and stresses out, has the right type of stressor, you can wipe out entire populations or entire ecosystems of corals. So it's important that we have a lot of new genetic material out on these reefs as they deal with these, changing environments. And on the conservation front, there's different ways of introducing that genetic material. So for example, with Seacor, they are trying to capture gametes right from the water column. So baby corals, egg and sperm that comes into the water column, they capture that egg and sperm, they bring it back into the lab, they mix it, and they allow it to turn into free swimming baby corals. And what's interesting is a lot of people, even me, I didn't really know this, that corals are actually free swimming at a stage in their life, at this Planeta stage. And in that stage, they will search through the ocean, they swim through the currents. They're tiny, so they're not swimming hardcore, but they have some control, and then they will find a place to settle. When they settle, they'll begin to grow a new coral, and that coral is then a new coral. Genetically speaking, it's a brand new individual. While on another front, we have introducing genetic material from individual coral colonies that are already established. So this is another really effective way of creating new genetic material in a population. And Aaron, and I can't wait to introduce Aaron to everyone, because he has this personality and this passion for what he does that's and he's really drawn me into him.
It's impossible not to like Aaron. He is full of energy. He's an amazing individual.
Totally. And so one thing that he's trying to do, and he'll explain it a hell of a lot better than I will, but surrounding the Cayman Islands, he's beginning to put out these, coral fragments. So in this case, it's a little bit different than the, sexual reproduction that you're getting from Seacor. This is, you're taking coral fragments and you're moving them into these microclimates that are a little more ideal for the coral to grow, and take them out of these potentially, in these areas that haven't been doing well, or areas that they've been doing great. And that's why you're moving them from that area to try to get them to populate in other areas. But once those corals mature to a point where they can produce egg and sperm naturally, now they're on these things called coral trees, which Aaron, I'm sure, will explain. So it's kind of this multifaceted approach of where you're introducing new coral, and it's incredible. It's really interesting to know that there's people that are dedicating their lives on, any of these nonprofits, and especially Aaron, are really dedicating their time and effort and energy and money into protecting these reefs that we love, and they deserve our attention. And that's why I'm so thrilled to be part of this podcast and bringing a little more attention to Aaron and the crew out there at Cayman Eco Divers.
Yeah, it's really remarkable what they're doing. A lot of this was started and funded out of their own pocket. They're now starting to get some corporate sponsorship down there. There's people like Kimpton is a large hotel resort on the island. They've got an interest in their helping. They've got actually a whole team that works at the restaurant that comes out and volunteers on a regular basis, as well as a lot of the other small businesses on the island. have a vested interest in seeing the ecoculture or the ecosystem there protected. And just to build on what you were saying there, Mitch, what he's doing now is even morphed a little more than what it was before. It used to be grow the fragments out on these trees, try and replant them, try and get the reefs going again. What he has discovered that between his tree plantations, I'm going to call them that for now, it looks like these fiberglass frameworks that are suspended by an air float underwater. And what he's discovered is since they put them in between the tree planting sites, because of how the Cayman Islands is located in occurrence work and whatnot, he's getting reproduction and new coral growth between the sites that wasn't there before. And they go out and do these regular surveys and count the corals. And he's noticed there's substantial increase in coral growth between the sites on the reef on its own. It isn't there in the other directions. So he's found that it might be more beneficial to encircle the island with these sites on these coral trees and let them spawn with between each other, and then start the gametes and the larvae landing and on the reefs and growing from there, because they're somewhat protected. They're not on the reef. They're not being attacked by damselfish or predators and stuff like that. They're getting cleaned regularly. And he's sort of tweaked his idea since he started. It's not just a strictly an outplant situation now. It's sexual reproduction right from the growth sites. And they've moved up from just the staghorn corals that they started with. They have got elkhorn on there too. And there was only, I forget, it's a very small number, maybe 8 pillar coral in the Caribbean region there. And some of them were being attacked by disease. So he got a call from the Cayman DOE, Department of Environment. They said, hey, can you help us rescue this coral? So now they have pillar corals growing on these trees as well that they hope to replant out there. So I can't wait to get Aaron on and explain it a whole lot better than I do. But considering this is all being done by volunteers and the impact that it's having, it's really quite impressive work.
Yeah, totally. So totally agree. We should leave it up to Aaron to really dig into that, and I'm super excited to talk to Aaron about it. And if there is any questions that you guys might have,
send them in.
Yeah, we will. Actually, you know what? We haven't set up a way of really.
We'll create an email and we'll put it. We'll get a link for you guys.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, we do have an email.
This is our pilot episode, so we're just getting our feet wet here and learning the equipment and trying things out. Mitch and I were supposed to have been to the Cayman Islands probably twice already since March, but with COVID, that all got shot. I go every year for the coral spawning, and I was supposed to go and accompany the winners from the Niagara Coral Show earlier in the summer too, and sort of be their guide for the island and escort them through the coral restoration program. But it's another one of those things that's not going to happen this year.
So there's one thing we can all agree on: it's COVID sucks.
Yep.
I was really, really looking forward to that trip.
Yeah,
and getting out there. But what's interesting is in the reef keeping hobby, we don't take we don't keep a lot of Caribbean species in our corals, in our kinks, sorry. And I find that the Caribbean coral reefs offer a totally different ecosystem than you'd see in other parts of the world. I remember even, me and Kelly, my wife's name's Kelly, and when we would dive in the Caribbean, and she's relatively new diver, but she's got quite a few dives on her belt now. But when we were first going out in the Caribbean, she's like, well, I thought everything was going to be a lot more colorful than this. And when I look at the Caribbean reefs, I see the motion, and I see the diversity and the structure of the coral and the different types of fish, and the Caribbean blows me away. But I always think it's interesting because as reef keeping hobbyists, and when we say things like Elkhorn coral, I got an Elkhorn coral in my tank right now that somebody's told me it's an Elkhorn coral. And if you look at the structure of the coral, it looks a lot like an Elkhorn coral on obviously like a miniature scale and with way different color. it's interesting because like there's this disconnect. I can't even say it's a disconnect because there are some people out there that know, you know, exactly what they're looking at in every single tank, but we attach all these funny names to every single coral that we see in our tanks, and then what they actually exist out in the wild might be completely different. So yeah, it'll be interesting. Something that I'd love to do in this podcast is to, you know, make a lot of connections between what you see out on the reefs and how can we take the things that we've learned from wild reefs and apply them in our tanks to make our tanks, you know, more better.
I think if we could take anything good from COVID, we should be learning some lessons about what is happening on the reefs. I've spoken to Aaron several times since March, and interesting things are going on when they take humans out of the picture. They did a study, the guys and Aaron went out and did a study in the harbor area of Cayman Islands because none of the cruise ships and whatnot are coming in, and it's been a lot quieter. Schools of fish that haven't been seen like that in years have started to come back and repopulate that area, and they're tracking all this stuff to just sort of see what's new, what's different, how is this impacting it, how is taking certain things out of the picture affecting things, because we may never get this opportunity again, hopefully, you know, on this under these circumstances, hopefully. But it has been quite interesting. I mean, and there are still bad things happening. I just was talking and reading some stuff yesterday where there was yet another ship incident on one of the, you know, very popular reef diving areas in the Cayman Islands, when a lot of silt and things were kicked up and were covering a lot of corals. There was, I believe I read, there was something like 200 volunteer divers came out to get under there over the last few days and try and waft the silt and sand off these reefs and try and save what they could. You know, as soon as you introduce humans into the picture, we make a mess of things.
Yeah, and it's you know, even when you were saying that, it was making me think a lot about you know, situations in our tanks. And one of the worst reefs, wild reefs I've ever seen was in Curacao. And what was happening out there was they were getting a lot of sedimentation from, well, they were getting a lot of runoff, I'll say, from the, you know, the village that was close by or the town close by. And then the other thing that was happening was, in theory, I mean, theoretically, this is what they think is happening so far, is that the currents, as they warm in the ocean, the currents are kind of changing. So areas that previously didn't receive a lot of nutrients and sediment naturally, like deposition zones, are now becoming the new deposition zones. So these areas that are prestige, you know, pristine coral reefs, that nutrient levels were, like we see in our tanks, you know, zero low, are now getting higher nutrients. And then what are we seeing? Just like in our tanks, you're seeing a lot of things like cyanobacteria. And in what I saw in Curacao, and I don't know what type it was, but it was a yellow cyanobacteria. And it would come and it would, you know, suck up nutrients, and it would die, and it would suck away oxygen as it was dying. And it would really impact the corals. And what happened actually was a lot of your structural diverse corals, you know, like what we would call SPS corals, stony corals that create a lot of structure on the reef. And in our tanks, you know, if you're a stickhead, that's what you love, is these sticks, you know, colorful sticks. And on these reefs, they were finding just a lot of, you know, grooved brain corals and things like that that are perceived to be more hardy under these higher nutrient and competitive conditions that are more associated with cyanobacteria. So this is something that, like, you when we see cyanobacteria in our tanks, right, just think of what's really the cause and how can we deal with it. And it's it'll be interesting. Lots of things that we can talk about in this podcast. I'm really thinking that we can dive totally inside of the coral reef keeping hobby, everything from, you know, why we keep fish and all of that kind of stuff, to the biology, to the, you know, the ecology out on the wild ecosystems, and all the way to the conservation. And of course, we're going to do our best to bring you as many great people that know how to keep incredible tanks. You know, I've been doing this now. As I said, my first reef tank was I was probably 16. So, you know, I've been keeping tanks for a long time now, and I can't call and I have a lot of education on this subject, and I still feel like an amateur in this industry. You know,
I think there's always something to learn, isn't there?
That's the best part. It's the best part. It's, you know, I look up to people like experts that are in our reef keeping hobby, from, you know, Julian Sprung to Richard Ross, and you know, all those guys are Sanjay, and, you know, there's so many, Pleta. There's so many amazing people out there that have spent so many years diving into this, and it's one of the best things about the hobby. Right.
And they're such accessible people. They're so willing to share their knowledge, which I think is key in all of this, in conservation, in the reef, all of it. I think that's the way you need to be. We don't need to hold things close to our chest. We need to share and make everything better.
Yeah. So I guess the purpose of this episode was really as a pilot episode, and like Ian and I do, we just started getting into it, and
yeah, we're just chatting. We usually do this in the store, and we thought, you know, sometimes we have something interesting to talk about. Let's share it with people.
Yeah. And yeah, so, you know, in the future, we're really going to try to target what we're talking about, and, you know, we're going to do our best to not ramble, but what we really want to make this an open discussion, and we want to bring in some experts. And what do you think?
Yeah, we want to bring in people that we know, people that we don't know, people that have something interesting going on in the world. There are lots of interesting people out there right now. And then from my side of things, I also want to bring in, I get a lot of questions that are very common, and things that we can talk about, you know, that come into the store. Well, what about this, or what about that? Or even sort of tips on, say, like your Ecotech pumps. Well, this happened, what do I do? Or that broke, what do I do? Or Neptune, or whatever. And those people are all accessible to us, and we can sort of share some of these tips and tricks, and sort of up everybody's game.
Yeah. And
something too, because I am far from an expert.
Yeah. There's definitely some things like that I really want to look into. I mean, I've talked to you a lot about cortisol and stress and things like that, and potentially doing some real tests on this kind of stuff. And I'd love to document it through this podcast. I really want to breed to spawn SPS corals in captivity as a hobbyist, from a hobbyist level. And I would love to document that. I got another thing that I've been kind of obsessing about lately is cryptic zones. You know, I remember this from a long time ago, and our tanks have gotten so high tech now that this type of thing we don't talk about as much, but I've always been obsessed with tanks that can kind of run themselves. And I remember seeing this tank when I was, you know, probably, you know, 5 years into the hobby, and saw this tank that was, the sump was pretty much open, and there were some dark areas in the sump. The skimmer column, which at that time was like a column in the sump, it was just kind of an open cylinder, and he didn't have a skimmer in it or anything. So basically all that the sump was a glass box. And at that time, I think he just had some sponges in it or something like that, and he didn't think about it too much. And this tank was, after not doing water changes at all, you know, he was saying that he didn't do water changes in 2 years, and this tank was just totally pristine, beautiful. Corals are popping, and the colors are there, and the water is crystal clear. But then you look in the sump, and you see this microenvironment of you know, small crustaceans and microinverts and all of those types of things that are creating a diversity that is hard to find in our newer tanks now, with the, you know, the you know, there's some give and take with starting tanks with dead rocket, but we'll get into all that.
Yeah, that's a big topic.
That's a big topic. Totally. That is like a 6 podcast goer.
There's a lot involved in that one.
Yeah. But
we're gonna mix it up. It'll be a little bit different every week. We're gonna try and make it interesting. We're new at this, but we just thought, you know what, there's stuff to be shared here, and we're not gonna tell you how to go and pick your gravel, or, you know, some of the basic things. We're hoping to dig a little deeper and answer some of those questions that all seem to come to us all eventually.
Totally. So yeah, I guess it's probably, I don't know how long we've been going for this for, but it's probably a good time to close it out and, make sure that we even recorded the audio properly. But if there is anything that you guys as listeners would like to hear from us, or if there's anything that you could mention, maybe there's something wrong with the audio, if there's something you hear in the background, this episode is really made to just help us work out some of the kinks.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if there's anything that you guys hear or notice that you think might make this podcast better, you can find us at forthereef.com. You can contact us through there, or of course through Sustainable Marine Canada.
Do you want to give them your For The Reef email since it's called For The Reef Podcast? Can they contact us that way?
Yeah, we actually have a For The Reef email, and Ian, it's called. It's called For The Reef Podcast at gmail.com.
Oh, there you go.
So there you go. And you can find us there. Both of us are active on Facebook and Instagram and stuff. So if you go to Sustainable Marine Canada, or you go to For The Reef, you'll find us on there, and you can shoot us a message through there until we get all this other stuff worked out. But for now.
Yeah, thanks for listening for now, and more to come.
More to come. All right. Well, thanks everybody, and have a good night, and happy reef keeping.